Lang nerds, welcome to eLang Explained. This video is a part of our core curriculum series where we break down some of the key concepts and pieces of metalanguage from Units 1 to 4 English Language. Today we're going to be talking about register, specifically the language features that can indicate formality. It's important to remember that register itself exists on a continuum all the way from informal text to formal text. In the middle, we have our mixed register text, and while you absolutely can label a text that is somewhere in between informal and formal as a mixed register text, it's often more strategic to label the register of these texts as mostly informal with elements of formality or mostly formal with elements of informality to signal your understanding that there is a more dominant register in the text. Now, when we're thinking about those texts that are mostly informal or mostly formal, they will absolutely have both formal and informal language features. But a text that is mostly formal is, of course, going to have more of those informal language features that are used more often throughout the text. Whereas a text that is mostly formal is going to have a majority of formal language features with only some informal language features mixed in. So, what do I mean by formal and informal language features? Well, when we're thinking about language features that can indicate informality, we should be aiming to focus our analysis around subsystem patterning, emoticons, colloquial language, swearing, context-specific graphemes, dysphemism, slang, emojis, and taboo language. And you can remember language features that can indicate informality using the mnemonic device SEX-CD-SET. Whereas language features that can indicate formality include rhetoric, jargon, subsystem patterning, euphemism, nondiscriminatory language, and doublespeak, which you can of course remember using the mnemonic RJ-SEND. Now, if you're a keen green bean, you have probably noticed that subsystem patterning is a language feature that can indicate both informality and formality. And this is because subsystem patterning includes phonological patterning, morphological patterning, syntactic patterning, and semantic patterning, which, depending on the way they are used in a text, can support an informal register or a formal register. So if you see an example of subsystem patterning, it's really important to carefully unpack that example and think critically about whether this language feature is supporting informality or formality. Because this video is all about formal language, we're going to spend some time now discussing in a little bit more depth what each of these formal language features involves. So we'll start off with rhetoric. Rhetoric refers to language that appeals to the audience's sense of logic or emotions or duty in order to persuade the audience to agree with one of our speakers or writers or to believe a specific idea or fact. Now, you might have heard logic, emotions, and duty referred to as logos, ethos, and pathos. And in your responses, it's totally okay to label rhetoric as either appealing to pathos, logos, or ethos, or rhetoric that appeals to logic, emotions, or a sense of duty. So, something like the imperative sentence, make sure to be respectful, quiet students while studying in the library, which is a sentence that I feel like I say to all of my students all the time when we go to the school library for a library work session. An imperative sentence which includes rhetoric that appeals to the audience's sense of duty. Because of course we all know that when we are in the setting of a library, there are specific expectations around our language use. And one of those is that reduced volume, so that other people in the library are able to fully enjoy themselves in that space. Up next, we have jargon. Now, as a formal language feature, jargon refers to technical, precise language that requires audience expertise or prior knowledge to be able to understand. And we know that jargon is language that is often associated with a specific occupation, hobby, trade, or social group. So whenever you're analysing an example of jargon, we should always be aiming to label the specific field that the jargon is from. So for example, tenor is a jargonistic noun from the field of VCE English Language, whereas slipstitch is an example of a jargonistic verb phrase from the field of sewing. You'll notice here that in both of these examples, we've absolutely been strategic and labelled not only the field that the jargon is from, but also for that first example labelled the word class and the second example labelled the phrase type. so that we can double our metalanguage with our analysis of jargon and show that more nuanced understanding of specific language features. Now, if you were responding to a short answer question that was specifically asking you about formal language features and their effect in the text, including jargon here is what is going to get you the mark for that formal feature. But in an essay or an AC, or even a short answer question that asks you to analyze language features and their effect more broadly, being able to link in that secondary piece of metalanguage is something that allows you to signal that more nuanced, detailed, and specific understanding of language features in a text and their relationship to concepts like register. Next, we have subsystem patterning. And like I said earlier on in this video, subsystem patterning is a language feature that can indicate both informality and formality. So when we're thinking about subsystem patterning, it's important to remember that this isn't just one thing. In fact, subsystem patterning includes phonological patterning, morphological patterning, syntactic patterning, and semantic patterning. Now you can see here, we've got all of the different types of patterning listed out and our mnemonic. If you'd like a refresher on any of these types of patterning, make sure to check out our patterning videos. Then we have euphemisms. Now, euphemisms are a language feature that can indicate formality, but they pair with dysphemisms, which are a language feature which can indicate informality. Both euphemisms and dysphemisms aim to negotiate taboo. Taboo refers to those topics that are a little bit socially uncomfortable for us to discuss. They're the kind of topics that we might talk about with our really close friends, but we don't generally talk about with people we have a wider social distance with. So when we're thinking about euphemisms, it's important to remember that unlike dysphemisms, euphemisms refer to language that negotiates a specific taboo through the use of language which is more socially acceptable and overtly prestigious. Because euphemisms aim to lessen or reduce the impact of the taboo being discussed and make that taboo more socially acceptable. So, our example of a euphemism is the verb phrase has passed away as an alternative to the verb phrase has died to negotiate the taboo of death. Because saying that a pet has passed away lessens the impact, it kind of reduces the harshness. Using the verb phrase has passed away when we're talking about the death of a pet makes that taboo topic of death a little bit more socially acceptable to discuss. Because if we say the pet has died, obviously there are much stronger negative connotations there. Now, one of the challenges with euphemisms is that euphemisms rely on inference. And so sometimes euphemisms and euphemistic language can absolutely make texts and key ideas more difficult to unpack and understand, particularly if the audience don't have the prior knowledge required to make the specific inference. Next up, we have non-discriminatory language. Now, non-discriminatory language is language that is inclusive and aims to unite the audience, specifically bringing together a wide range of people in the audience without discriminating or identifying specific people or groups based on their traits. So our example of non-discriminatory language is the noun phrase members of the student body, which refers to all students at a school without specifically identifying students based on their year level, their gender, their interests, their excitement about studying English language. Referring to students as a student body or members of the student body allows for this wide, diverse group to be referred to in a non-discriminatory way, in a very inclusive way that brings this student body together. And lastly, we have doublespeak. Now, doublespeak includes language that is overly euphemistic and jargonistic, that is deliberately used to manipulate or obfuscate information by making the key idea that the writer or speaker is trying to communicate more difficult for the audience to discern and figure out. Now, when we are analysing our formal language features, if you notice an example of euphemism, wonderful. If you notice an example of jargon, excellent. If you notice the two together, and they're being used in a way that requires that inference, that prior knowledge, that makes an idea a little bit more difficult for the audience to figure out because it requires that additional level of inference, it's probably also doublespeak. And so when we're analysing doublespeak, it's important to acknowledge the role that euphemism and jargon can play in creating this doublespeak. So our example for doublespeak today is the verb phrase letting them go, which is doublespeak that can refer to the process of firing an employee. Here, this verb phrase is also euphemistic because it's softening that taboo of being fired or of firing an employee. There's definitely also a case that could be made here too, that letting them go is a jargonistic collocation from the field of employment, that it's language that is absolutely specific to managers, bosses. It's language that is specific to that field of the workplace. And so if you haven't been in a workplace before, you might not be familiar with this term. And it might be that little bit more difficult for you to figure out what is actually happening because of the doublespeak. So once we've identified the register and we started to identify the language features in the text, it's really important for us to ask ourselves 3 critical questions and consider the language features, the expectations of language within the situational context of the text, and the text's purpose and intent. So when we're thinking about those language features, it's important for us to consider whether the text includes language features that indicate informality or formality or both, and then to consider how these features are being used within the text. Next, it's important for us to consider how the expectations of language within the situational context influence language choices within the set text. So we ask ourselves the question, what expectations of language exist for texts with this field, this mode, this tenor, this text type, and this setting? And then how are these expectations maintained or challenged within the set text? And lastly, we have to consider purpose and intent and ask ourselves that critical question of how does the use of language features, which can indicate register, support the purpose and intent of the text? And of course, today we've been focused on formal language. So if we're looking at a text that has formal language features, for this question, we might be asking ourselves, how do language features in this text clarify information? How do they obfuscate or manipulate information? How do they reinforce expertise or authority? And if you'd like a refresher on any of the formal purposes and intents, make sure to check out our video on this topic. But that's all we have time for today. So be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.